for coming this evening. So what we have tonight, as you've probably heard, is a panel discussion and some opportunity also for engagement with you all on civil dialogue in uncivil times. We've put together what I think is a really dynamic and special panel of both people from the academy, from university, as well as from foundations in the area and state government, to provide perspective, to engage in a dialogue, and to have conversation about the issues today. And so the way that tonight will hopefully unfold for us is I'm going to allow each of the members up here to spend a few minutes to introduce themselves and how they come to the topic of civility, which, as you all should be very well aware of, is a key part of the curriculum here at UD. And then engage in some really healthy discussion for a little bit up here before turning it over and allowing you all to ask some questions to the panel. And hopefully at the end we'll have some time on the way out. If anybody would like to engage and chat with people up here, you're more than welcome to. But I want to thank you for taking the time to come. I know that Friday at 5 is a really prime slot for events on campus. And so I appreciate your being here, your attention, and I really do hope that you enjoy the discussion, the dialogue, and engage a bit with the topic that we're going to be covering tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to start to my left, your right, with Dr. Mary Stuckey from Penn State.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'd like to start by thanking Joe and all the folks here at Dayton for this important event, and to Amy and the people who do all the backstage work. Putting on events like this isn't easy, and the people who do the invisible work are some of the most important people on a campus, so thank you all. My name, as Joe told you, is Mary Stuckey. Academically, and Joe would probably also tell you in life, I'm just a little weird. I was trained as a political scientist, but I've spent most of my career studying political and especially presidential rhetoric out of from both political science and departments of communication, which is where I am now. My current department, the Communication of Arts and Sciences at Penn State University, is very much dedicated to issues of civil and civic dialogue, which are not necessarily, I think, the same thing. My work, because I'm trained as a political scientist, has a strong institutional focus. And from that angle, like many rhetoricians, I worry a little bit when we talk about civility. Don't get me wrong. When we talk about dealing with other people one-on-one, civility is very important indeed. But when we're looking at the institutional level, norms of civility have often been used to suppress minority voices, to impose policies on others, and to silence those working for social justice. In some of my work, I've talked about how we can think of civility in at least 3 ways. Civility as manners, which is probably the thinnest description of civility. Civility as political friendship, which involves a kind of giving and taking, and also the principle of charity. And then the one I personally favor, which deals with civility as political community. This last conception relies on inclusion as reconciliation, embraces the idea that people and the interests they represent will always struggle with one another. It depends on a notion of shared sacrifice and discomfort, legitimizes a wide range of political tactics, and depends on solidarity as practice. It's an impossible bar for actual communities to reach, but it is, I believe, an ideal worth striving for if you believe in democracy.
Oh, still writing. Oh, okay. Hey guys, how you doing? Is it going to be like that tonight? Really? All right. I reiterate what Mary said, and thanks, Joe, and thank the panel, thank the staff that helped put this together. Particularly thank Governor Taft, who, when he calls, I come running, which is a sign of civility. He's a Republican, I'm a Democrat. But I got to work around the legislature and served when he was governor, and so I know him real well. And he's a super human being, and sometimes I think he's a Democrat because he's so nice. Let me give you a little background on me. I'm not going to give you the whole shtick, but I'm a former staff person. I took a job in the legislature as a staff person because I needed a job. And then I fell in love with the institution because of what it's capable of doing. All the things it touches, the ways that we can order policy to help people grow and move in their lives and maximize their potential. And I used to stay really late, like really weirdly late, like why don't you have a life late, right? And but I would read and I would try to learn the policy and figure out how that impacted people. And so I eventually ran for office because people asked me to, but just between us, don't tell anybody, I could not speak in front of a crowd of people the day I agreed to run for office. So I never thought I would run for office when I was a staff person learning all those things. But it really translated into being able to do the job. And so that's sort of the backdrop of me as an elected person. And I share that with you because sometimes where you start as a elected official, what you wanted to do, you know. I didn't see myself doing this, so you don't necessarily have baggage of people who have wanted to be elected since they were 5 years old, which I think is super weird, by the way. But so those have an impact. One of the things that I've never lost track of as a backdrop for how I approach civility, I also have to tell you, it's always the civil people that get invited to these civility discussions. You need to get the other folks in the room, but is that I never lose track of the fact that Republicans are not my enemy. They are Ohioans, they are Americans, and in almost, with a couple of exceptions on some social issues, almost in every other case, we all want the same things. We just differ on the path to get to it. So here's the punchline. You have to focus on making us stay on track with that. You have to make us not, or not allow us to degrade the conversation into personal or misrepresentations or obfuscations or sleight of hands. You have to force the issue. As Mary said, she's weird. You guys are a little weird too. And what I mean by that is you care. You're here. You're here listening to this. You're here trying to learn this. Most people don't want to do this. They don't like it. They don't like politics. It bores them. They don't trust it. And they don't pay attention. And what that means is your responsibility now becomes greater. As the people that actually are a little weird because you care, you have to do more work. And you have to make sure things are illuminated, that people do hear what they don't want to hear, and that you do force the issue so that we're actually problem solving instead of taking attacks at each other. I remember I took my first logic class. How am I doing on time? Am I going too long?
You're all right.
All right. I remember I took my first logic class where they taught me how people weren't answering my questions. And I realized for years people had not been answering my questions. I didn't know it. And so pay attention to when you ask somebody something, did they actually answer your question or not? And insist upon it. In America, I am not the government. And don't let people trick you about that. In America, you're the government. I am your employee. I work for you. I'm your employee. Imagine if you had a company or a store and you had employees in there and you never checked on them. You didn't watch them all the time. You didn't make sure they were doing things the way that you wanted them done. You might not make any money. You might not have any product. You might not have any customers. And so it's okay to be respectful to people in elected office, but don't get carried away with it. We're your employees. We work for you. You are the government, and you need to insist, not necessarily civility in the sense that I think Mary was concerned about, is that you're so polite that you forget to disagree when you don't agree with somebody. That's not the same thing. I will argue to the death on issues, on policy, on are we helping people or are we not helping people? Which people are we helping? Do they need the help or do these people need it? How much resource goes into that? Are taxes inherently a bad thing? They're not, by the way. I will argue those all day long. I'll get amped up and I'll do that. And that's okay because that's what you pay us to do. But what you did after hours or what you do in your personal life or all those kinds of things, or me just simply not showing you the respect to answer your question, that is something you need to hold us accountable for. And we'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm Valerie Lemmy. I am the Director of Exploratory Research at the Kettering Foundation. And I'm going to talk about civility in the context of, one, having served my career primarily as a city manager and for a small stint as the Public Utilities Commissioner for the state of Ohio. And now my work at a research foundation that studies how to make democracy work as it should. As a civil servant, I came to realize that often when people are in civil, it's because of their anger, their frustration. They've had it. We didn't answer the questions they asked. They tried to come to a meeting of a city council, and we're told you've got 3 minutes to speak, and while they're talking, no one's listening. They knocked on a door, no one answered, and so it's a lot of angst and frustration. I also was a civil servant in the city of Cincinnati, and we had riots after the, I think, 13th shooting of an African-American male under questionable circumstances in the dark of night in an alley on a misdemeanor warrant, and the city exploded. And in that environment, people's tensions were raw, relationships were tough, and the hardest part as a civil servant, as a woman of color, was for me to be boycotted where I walked and where I went by other African Americans who were chanting, "No justice, no peace." It just broke my heart for them to think that I did not understand what their anger and their frustration was about, and that I saw my role as being in the system but not becoming the system in order to make change. And I had to just really remember my Christian teachings and my grandmother's words, treat people the way you want to be treated, and not get angry in return, because that's not very productive, but to recognize that the fear and generations of frustration in police community relationships, the lack of a sense of economic parity, and certainly civil injustices. And I happened to be sitting at the point when that exploded, and it was my responsibility to try to make a positive difference. And so we can change the nature of the conversation, which we were fortunately able to do in Cincinnati, by changing what it is we're talking about. What's the problem behind the problem, and how can we remind ourselves of the things that we have in common? And often we can do that through the process of deliberation, that we really sit down and talk about our values, what's important to us, what are the trade-offs that we have to make. And it's that understanding and that experience of having to be in a position where people weren't very nice to me, and yet still responsible for running the day-to-day operations of a $3 billion corporation. And so with that, I will say thank you, and I look forward to our conversation and the discussion with my colleagues. Joe?
So I am, for those of you that don't know, I'm Joe Valentano. I'm the chair of the Department of Communication here at UD. And I guess what I'll say really briefly is a little bit more geared to Com 100 and what you guys read and what you guys have read in that class in terms of civility. And I'd just point out that as I said at the outset, it's integral to the curriculum and the experience of being at UD, is the idea, not simple politeness, but also this is the point I think that is key in the civility chapter in the Com 100 book. It's also about being assertive. And a lot of this work is actually drawn from a man by the name of P.M. Forney, who's at Johns Hopkins, and he runs the Civility project there. And I was really struck about 8 years ago when I first encountered his work, and he mentioned the fact that civility is central to, assertiveness is central to civility, in that civility is not simple politeness, it's not just good manners, it's not just what we're known for here, one of the many things we're known for here, holding doors open for folks. It's also about being able to respectfully but strongly assert your own position. Because when you don't, if you hear something you disagree with and you don't point it out or you don't engage, then you're actually not being civil to yourself, because you are denying your own ability to contribute to the discussion. You're denying your own ability and your own responsibility to engage in important conversations. And so for me, that's really, I think, what differentiates civility, the way that we teach it here and the way that I define it, from the way I think most people in the popular press or perhaps the general population use it, which is more of a mechanism of being polite and being nice. Being assertive does not mean being aggressive. It doesn't mean being nasty. As a matter of fact, it's not those things. But it is being able to feel comfortable stating your own position, your own ideas, and welcoming with an open mind the ideas of others. And hopefully being able to allow them to contribute to the way that you shape your perspective. I know that reading and encountering the concept of civility in that way really fundamentally altered the way that I approach people, the way that I approach the work that I do, and it really influences the way I see public discourse and politics in general. I really think that it's a necessary thing for us to I guess from the perspective of Gandhi, perhaps to be the change that we want to see. You owe it to yourselves and you owe it to the people around you and the community in which you live to be civil and to be a meaningful and responsible participant on issues with which you care about. So,
I'm Bob Taft. I teach in political science here at UD. Before that, I spent 30 years as an elected official in the state of Ohio, where I worked with State Representative Fred Strayhorn and with State Senator Peggy Lehner. And I just want to thank them for being here and point out to you that they are both, not only do they represent the Dayton area in our state legislature, but they are also both leaders in the state legislature. Fred, modest as he is the leader of the Democratic caucus in the Ohio House of Representatives. And Senator Lehner is chairman of the Senate Education Committee. In that capacity, they both have to work closely with many colleagues, many interest groups, many people throughout the state of Ohio. So this evening is a great opportunity for you to question them about how do they work with the citizens that they represent on the issues of public policy that come before the state legislature.
I'm up. Talk about modesty. There's eight of those 30 years were as governor of the state of Ohio.
She's my promotional agent.
Right. As if you need it. Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting this. This is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart, quite frankly, because as someone who has been in public office now for close to 20 years, which I guess makes me a career politician. I didn't start till I was 45, so helps. But this is an issue that has had ups and downs as far as I'm concerned. When I served on the Kettering City Council for 11 years, that was a nonpartisan position. You didn't run as a Republican or a Democrat, and nor did you serve as a Republican or Democrat. And the issue of civility, frankly, was almost non-existent. You'd have, maybe a community member come in and complain about something that they were worked up about, and they might get a little bit over the line, but in generally, it was not an issue. Then I went to the state legislature, and that was totally different. Suddenly was in an environment where Republicans and Democrats didn't even go out to dinner together. You didn't work together, except when it was really expedient for you. It didn't need to be that way, and it still doesn't need to be that way. And my dream, frankly, is to sometime take an issue like a tough issue, like school funding, for example, and put a bunch of Republicans and a bunch of Democrats in the room and say, forget what party you belong to, solve this problem. And I think it would be awesome. I mean, what they would come up with would be something everyone would say, hey, that's great. And why we don't do that, I don't know. But civility there is much more of an inter-party thing. It's very partisan driven. The civility, however, or incivility that concerns me most is what we're seeing today. It is no longer constrained to the halls of legislatures, city halls or the halls of Congress. Now it's a question of each and every one of you in this room, how you relate to each other, how we talk about issues in general. I'm kind of curious, this might not work with this group, but how many of you have avoided going to a social event or a family event or something you normally would have gone to because you just don't want to listen to someone talk either for or against Donald Trump? Quite a few hands, and I have a feeling if you kept thinking, you'd probably come up with more. This is what strikes me as a real concern right now, and I'm not going to take sides in that, but the environment that is created today is absolutely toxic. And the thought of sitting down and trying to work on something like school funding together, it's just a pipe dream. I don't even think about it anymore because I'm just worried about getting through the day without having to deal with some of this garbage. So I repeat, I think this is a fabulous event. Looking forward to the discussion tonight, and thanks for letting me be here.
Thank you all. Senator, that's, I think a great, transition into some of my thoughts and perspectives and experience on this. But first, I just want to thank all y'all all y'all, I'm from Texas. I know that's probably not. I used to live in Ohio. I lived in Ohio for 3 years. That was my first faculty position, and I've assimilated Texan speech. So that's me. But I appreciate that you guys, that's better, have come out here this evening, because I think one area of common ground we'd share is that you're the future of this. And I think we share in this room probably a common concern for where we're at as a society. That's why we're here on a Friday night talking about civility versus out doing other things we might want to do. There might be extra credit involved in that too, but I hope that that concern about the future of our society is part of what brings you here as well. So I am Andrew Ledbetter. I am a professor at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. My research as a scholar touches on this question of civility in a couple of ways. One is I study communication technology. And, as we think about technology, I'm sure well, let me ask you this, in fact, have you ever seen political discourse on a social media site that you would characterize as uncivil? My hand sort of goes up, I don't know, yeah. Now, I'm not going to just throw technology under the bus and say that that's the cause. I think that human beings are the cause, and we're responsible for how we use technology. At the same time, might there be something about technology that leads us to dehumanize others in ways that we would not do if we were face-to-face? I think that's more than possible. I think that's certainly obvious that that does happen. So that concerns me as a scholar of technology. But like Peggy said, I'm also concerned as an interpersonal communications scholar. I study families, I study interpersonal relationships, and I realize the value of those for our health, for our well-being, for the quality of our individual lives, as well as the quality of our collective life. And in the wake of the 2016 election in particular, I mourn the reports I've seen on media and also the things I've seen in my social networks of people shunning each other or pulling away from each other, even breaking contact over a political disagreement. And politics is important, okay? It's important. But I would contend that our interpersonal relationships, our friends and family, are even more important. That's very much the glue that holds our society together to a large extent. So I mourn that, and I hope that we can find ways to be civil with each other, yes, in the political discourse that we see, but also in the interpersonal relationships that we have with each other.
So now that we've done kind of introductions and brought everyone's perspective kind of to the table, I guess it's time to get down to brass tacks and ask some really tough questions, but I'll start with a softball. And feel free to chime in. So recently, some of you may have seen in the news, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, "You can't be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about." Additionally, you have a president who routinely violates norms of civility in his statements and tweets, while also calling reporting and treatment of certain people and topics unfair. What does this say about the hope for civility in public dialogue? And does it matter that almost half of Americans, according to a recent Rasmussen Reports poll, disagreed with the secretary?
Almost half?
It was 47% disagreed.
Okay, so I do national politics, so I'll start with this one and give other people a place to respond to. In general, one of the powers of the so when Harry Truman was president in the late 1940s, he was giving a public talk. And Harry Truman was famous for kind of shooting at the hip. He thought he was witty. He wouldn't always pause to think. Sometimes he said things that he would regret. And so he's giving this public talk, and a student, he's at a university, I think he's at UCLA, some university in California. And a student asks him a question. And the question had a little bit of an edge to it, and Truman didn't like that very much at all. And Truman snaps at the kid, "That's the stupidest damn thing I've ever heard." And the kid is like, you know, he just got slapped down by the President of the United States. And this is in like the late 1940s when that was, you know, even more of a thing. And this kid is just, and Truman realized, oh Lord, like, you know, and he has the Secret Service come get the kid. So the kid is now completely freaked out, right? So not only does he get slapped by the president, but now the Secret Service is like dragging him backstage. And he goes back to the president's, where the president is waiting for him in the green room. And when Truman tells this story, because the story comes from Truman, and I believe his autobiography, but I could be wrong about that. Truman says, "I had forgotten for a moment the power of the presidency to hurt." And he apologized to the kid, and of course he'd slapped him in public and apologizes to him in private, so there's that. But then he writes this kid a letter every week until the kid had graduated from college. To make sure that that young man was okay, that he hadn't done so much damage that it was irreparable for this young man. And I have no idea what happens after that, but it's kind of an important story, I think, in this context, because the power of the presidency to do damage, not just to the person that you may target in a moment of sort of aberrant irritation. Harry Truman was an irritable kind of guy. But the way that presidents and public officials conduct themselves models for the rest of us the limits of democratic discourse. What are the possibilities? So when the Democratic speaker speaks to the governor, to a Republican governor, and does so in a way that's productive, that is modeling for their colleagues and for the rest of us the possibilities of common ground, of compromise, of the way that democracies work. And when they refuse to do that, they are also modeling for us the limits and capacities of democracy. And so I would just start with that, I think.
I would totally agree with what you said. However, my initial reaction when I heard that was if Mike Pence, let's take Trump out of it. If Mike Pence had said that exact same thing, the other 53% would have agreed with him. It wasn't what was being said, it was who was saying it. And I think that's the reality of so much of what's going on right now.
So that's my takeaway. What I was going to say, my takeaway is it's an erosion, and it's really not about Donald. Donald Trump is symptomatic of something that's been happening in America for 30 or 40 years. If you go back to the 60s or 70s and you check the voting of Democrats and Republicans in Congress, they voted with their party 60% of the time and against their party 40% of the time. What does that tell you? What it tells you is they were thinking for themselves. And they were trying to make decisions that they thought were best for their districts and for the country based on what they truly believed. Now it's 90-10, and what that tells me is we've become so tribal. It's more of a cult of personality, and if you're my tribe and you say it, then that's what it is. And that is where the concern lies, is that whether you're a Democrat or Republican, it's happening in both places, and people aren't thinking as much for themselves as they are siding up. And I'm not going to go against the person on my team, even if it damages my state or my country. And that's what bothers me the most, is the inability to separate. There are things that are off limits in politics that my country comes before my party. And we've slid on that, and that should be of grave concern to a lot of people.
I would offer that we are looking to the wrong people to set our own direction. Instead of looking to outsiders and elected officials, we ought to look at ourselves. We ought to be the ones to decide what is appropriate behavior and what is not. And Fred, you mentioned in your earlier comments, hold people accountable. So what is your perspective on civility? How can you ensure civility? If we have polarized politics, 90-10, and certainly at some point we'll probably talk about money and the impact money has on the influences of party politics. But also if we talk about what our responsibility as citizens. Most of us care about what happens in our respective communities, where we live, where our families live, and those are the issues that we are most concerned about. That's not what's generally being talked at the national level. It's not what's being covered at the media, but that's where we are. And what if we got together on a wicked community problem that we were concerned about, and we sat down and we talked to our neighbors and we thought about what was happening, and we said, you know, this isn't a right or wrong issue. This is an issue of values. It's what is really the most important to me. And we understood what was important to our neighbor and why it was important to our neighbor. We may not agree with them, but I do have a perspective that I didn't have before, a perspective that allows me to wrestle with the trade-offs, understand where they're coming from, and maybe be able to reach common ground on what we can do together to fix problems. The obfuscation of things that are less important to us at the community level is something we should avoid. What can I do every day in my community with my neighbor to tackle an issue, whether it's education or homelessness or whatever might be the concerns of my community? And I think once we as citizens recognize that democracy is our role to take power and determine what our future as a nation is, then the narrative will change, the dialogue will change, and it won't be either or. It really will be the citizens are leading a democracy, and we're leading it in a way that makes sense to us and recognizes our values that include common concern for shared problems.
I think I'm surprised that Secretary Clinton said that, and I'm disappointed that she said that because it seems to follow in the train of some comments that other prominent Democrats have said that hint at a lack of civility. But I think to practice kind of what you're saying, Valerie, I think rather than saying they're terrible that they said that, and we may want to say that because that does promote incivility, but I'd also be curious to ask, okay, why do you feel that way? Particularly for those that might resonate and say, yeah, let's go and, you know, smack the Republicans down. Okay, well, what's going on there? And is there a way we can maybe dial that down and hear each other's perspective better? But what I fear is actually something else that Secretary Clinton said that I think has gotten swept under the rug, because really this comment seems like it's kind of doubling down on the whole deplorables comment that she made. You remember that? The Trump supporters, about half of them are deplorables. And that's gotten a lot of attention, and I would agree that was an uncivil thing to say. I would say she should not have said that. But something else she said bothers me even more. She said that some of them are irredeemable. Irredeemable. I mean, I sit here at a Catholic university as a Protestant coming here talking to you. I think that to the extent that perhaps some of us in this room would share a same faith background, I would say people are not irredeemable. What a horrible thing to say about a human being. If you believe that somebody is irredeemable, that might lead you to treat them in very uncivil manners. And even if they're very far gone, at least my understanding of my faith would say, hey, there's still hope for redemption. Now that's faith. Okay, but if that's true with things that are supernatural, how much more for things that are earthly can we hope that, hey, maybe you might come around, or maybe we can find some place of common ground where we can meet and we can work together despite differences that we might have.
It occurs to me that all panelists, especially the legislators, have to deal with people all the time in their jobs, and legislators need information to do their jobs. They have to be informed about what citizens are thinking and what they're believing. And so I'm interested in whether the legislators and our panel experts as well have tips for students about what you do in a situation to try to encourage a conversation and dialogue. Mm-hmm. You know, for example, we know it's a two-way street, so that means listening. Well, what if the people that you're working with and need information from aren't listening even to what you are saying? What do you do in that situation? What are there practical tips or techniques or strategies that can somehow break through and create dialogue where it's not happening in a specific conversation? So start with our legislators and maybe then go to our panel of experts, our true national experts.
You want me to go? Okay. I think one of the things is to have rules about how you engage in conversation, particularly around really controversial issues. I mean, when you are yelling at each other, nobody's learning from that. Nothing's being accomplished. Many times the answers lie a little bit of our stuff, a little bit of their stuff. I mean, that's when you tend to find really good answers to problems. When it has to be my way, or we're going to shut stuff down, or the highway. You're only getting half of a perspective. So when we've done our best work, I found it is when we can listen to each other, we can learn from each other, when we talk to each other. We do a little bit of Republican or conservative, a little bit Democrat, a little bit liberal. We find true answers for people. But I have rules about how I engage. I ignore a lot of stuff, by the way. You can't ignore everything, but don't fall into the traps. Don't fall into the things that make you mad and lash out, because that's when all the arguing starts. That's when all the listening stops. And so it takes some discipline, but if you have rules that you've used over and over and over, that you've practiced over and over, it's extremely helpful when you're dealing with divisive, controversial issues. Again, I always lean on, my anchor is how I come to the conversation to begin with. Republicans are not my enemy. I disagree with them on some things, but I also learn from them. I hope they learn from me. And when you can keep the temperature down and actually talk to each other, actually listen to each other, you can actually problem solve. And you make the thing that you're trying to accomplish the bigger issue, more so than your ego, more so than your party, and to some degree even more than your perspective or ownership, right? I want to solve this problem, and that means more to me than everything else going on around me. And if you focus on that and you have rules to help keep you on track, you tend to get a lot further with that. After a while, it becomes a little bit easier with the people that you work with who know who you are. Part of the problem is trust, right? Nobody wants to get got, so everybody comes to the table with a certain level of distrust. And until I've interacted with you a little bit, until we've done a few things and you've behaved the right way all the time, I go, all right, he's not so bad. He didn't do that last time. He didn't do it the time before that. He probably means well. And so, but a lot of it's about habit. It's about developing a habit, about being about what you say you're about, and being true to that. But at the end of the day, particularly in a public policy situation, my focus is almost always on you. It's what you want, what you need, and what that real solution is. And if I get to own it, great. If I don't, that's fine too. If I had to take 35% of my stuff and 65% of Peggy's, fine. That's great. Peggy's a wonderful woman. She's a good friend. But we have to do that. But you, again, I'm going to probably say this throughout the night. You have to insist upon that.
Just real quickly, don't do what far too many people do, and that's end up a letter with, I will never vote for you. Don't do it. But seriously, one thing I think is worth trying is ask a question of the legislature, and a deep question. So even, I mean, let's say you're writing on climate change. Ask that legislature, say, you know, I agree with your position on this, but I'm bothered by X, Y, and Z, fill in blanks. Can you explain to me what you're thinking? And the reason I'm saying that is that avoids your letter being put in a for and against pile. You've almost sort of invited them and requiring them to give you an answer, and it probably isn't the stock answer. We do tend to write sort of form letters on issues, you know. We just do. There's too many to do in the day. But you might plant a seed in their mind that gets them thinking away from whatever the tribal answer is to a particular answer, and to actually give that issue more thought than they might otherwise. Just a thought.
Can I add one other? The other thing I would add to it is if you're dealing with somebody and you're opposite, find out what motivates them. Just a real quick story. I had this issue that was going on, and one of my members said it's going to create a problem down the road. And I called the speaker, who's usually pretty gracious to me, and he's like, no, it's fine. My guy tells me it's great, and there's no problem. And I knew I wasn't getting through, and I had to figure out what could I say to actually get him back on board. And I said, if you believed me, would you care? And he said, oh, of course I care. What are you talking about? I said, well, then give me 3 minutes. And so he gave me those 3 minutes. We were able to sit down at the table. We were talk this out. We got the experts on the phone, and we're able to work through the problem. But if I can't think of what could I say that he would care about, what would move him to that point, that would have gone through. We wouldn't have been able to solve the problem. We wouldn't have been able to fix it, all of which we were able to do. But try to understand what motivates people. Is it fear? Is it anxiety? Whatever it is, and try to speak to that to get them to the table to work through stuff.
If I might speak strategically, particularly for local governments, I would suggest do your homework. Where is the decision point on an issue you're concerned about, and how can you influence that decision point? If, for example, you're going to the city council meeting on the day of the vote, it's too late. The decision has already been made, but for the vote, it's done. It's when they're in committee that the issues are discussed. It's in committee that you have the greatest opportunity to influence the decision before a recommendation is sent forward. It is by talking to people genuinely about your concerns. If you want someone to listen to you, then you have to give them the reason why. And sometimes it is expressing your concern, your story. Most of us are motivated by the stories of experience. Why is this issue important to you? What has happened in your experience that you really have a passion for something and you want to be heard? What we talk about at the foundation is your voice can be so powerful, and to the extent that that voice is collective, there are more people in your community who think the same way. Then organize that voice. And then lastly, don't just come to City Hall or to a legislator and say, you need to do this or you need to fix this. Talk about what you're doing in your community. The notion of co-production, that we're both able, citizen and institution, to do something together. What are you doing in your community? An example I gave very quickly to a class earlier today was a colleague of mine who decided that he wanted to make a difference in the homeless community. And he started with a conversation with a homeless person, and he said, you know, what's your name, and, you know, where's your family? And the person was open to the conversation, told who the family was, and this individual was able to connect the homeless person, a man, with his family. That was an inspiration for him to say, well, one person, we can do more. So 3 years later, they've connected maybe 250 homeless people with loved ones, and it didn't require any institution to do anything. So sometimes recognize your civic power, your community assets, and then when you say, we are doing this in our community and this is what the institutions can do to help, it makes a huge difference in the responses that you're going to get both from appointed and elected officials.
Could I ask a question of, you know, those of you on the panel that have worked in government here, and we have, you know, I love these suggestions about how to reach out to public officials. How about just getting informed? Because I struggle with that, honestly, especially with our media being so focused on national issues, especially in the current administration. You know, getting informed on what's going on in my city, my county, my state. I struggle. I probably need to struggle more to find the information, but I struggle with that because I found when I have looked, the information is sometimes hard to find. So, if you're a student here and you're saying, hey, I want to be an engaged citizen at the local level, at the state level, just by getting informed about what's going on, do you have any suggestions about how to learn about those kinds of issues?
Well, I think if you want to avoid being a generalist, knowing a very little bit about a lot of different things, there are ways to do that, read the paper, so on and so forth. But I think it's probably more constructive to get involved with something that you have a passion about. If it's education, start going to all the school board meetings. Start looking at what the top topics are that are on that area, that are out there, and just look for opportunities to develop a deep knowledge of an issue. I often get asked by people, what should I do to get, I'd like to run for public office someday. And I say, get passionate about some issue. You aren't going to work on just that issue when you get to the legislature or the city council, but it gives you a real leg up, and I think the same's true if you just want to be engaged.
So you're kind of saying going deep rather than broad is
Go
useful.
deep.
You get in this issue, learn it, and then you can branch out from there.
Right.
That's great.
Also, if you might, most communities have a academy or a leadership program to learn about local government. Dayton for example, since we're in the city of Dayton, they have a Citizens Leadership Academy. And if you're interested in finding out about city government, how the issues are addressed, where there are volunteer opportunities to serve on a board or a commission, they take volunteers, first come, first serve. They do the program every year. They love to have citizens come in and say, we want to know more about our local government. So there are institutional ways to find out more about government as well.
So I'm going to fuss at y'all just a tiny bit here. Which is that I appreciate, and I think you're right, for all of the suggestions that you've made, but there's an underlying premise that I think I want to quibble with, because there seems to be a presumption in some of this advice that everyone has equal access to the system and an equal voice once they get to that system. And because I'm an institutionalist, I want to go, wait. Not everyone has, one of the things we teach in college, right, other than sitting in rows and your social security number, which I swear to God is the clearest thing I remember from my college years, is that you're no longer afraid of forms. Anyone who has registered or gone through financial aid at a major university in this country is never going to be intimidated by a government form ever again. Right? But there are people who are less literate than you, who find these forms terrifying, who don't register to vote because that might mean they end up on jury duty and they lose their job. That the idea that we must all approach politics in this particular way presumes that the avenues of approach are equally open. And our history of the civil rights movement, just to name one, indicates the ways in which sometimes you have to do things that look uncivil or that are treated by the establishment as less than ideal in order to get the attention of the people who can make a difference in policy. And so without disagreeing at all there, I do want to point to the fact that part of the job of citizenship is also making sure that the avenues are equally open to people who don't have the privileges that someone like me may have had. So I just
what's interesting about that is the civil rights movement, particularly Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it was all about civility. And the young radicals who came along with organizations like SNCC, who were less inclined to be civil. But it was the moral rightness of what they were doing. They were very civil, they were very silent, they were all dressed up, they were lockstep, and they brought a moral rightness to what they did, and that brought action. So even in that, and using that as an example, civility is what made the difference.
And yet Martin Luther King was accused over and over again of lacking civility.
But
right, so there's that as well.
Oh, absolutely, and you can see the tapes for yourself. I was old enough to be able to be a part of that experience myself. But I think the idea is civility does not mean you should not make demands, express yourself, and as you, in your introduction, Joe talked about, be assertive about your positions and your values and your views. You can be that way and still be heard. You can be silent in your protest and still be heard through civility.
And I would agree with all those, and I would add to, I mean, part of the question was, how do you learn what's going on? And, you know, you guys are bombarded by information now. It's like drinking from a fire hose. It's just, everything's coming at you. My suggestion is diversify your news sources. Don't get all your news from one place. Try to go every so often. I watch Fox, right? And I try to reconcile things that I hear when they're way out of whack and try to find some other source that confirms something. And so the more you can diversify where you get your news from and not just take anybody one side or the other at face value, you're the strongest person for me if I want to do right, no matter what party I'm in. You're the strongest person for me if you know what's going on. The more informed you are, you can't be tricked by anybody. So my conversation with you is going to be way better if I'm trying to do the right thing. So, I mean, for me, I encourage people, you don't have to take my word for it, because if you go look it up, nobody comes in behind me and tricks you. So anybody that doesn't want you to confirm what they're doing or say it is up to something. So, but try to diversify that. When you run into a bump, try to reconcile what you heard as best you can.
I would just add, seek out mentors and be very energetic in asking them a lot of questions. And that's easier, obviously, if you're involved in an organization in which you're in some kind of a common cause. But just seek out someone who knows about an area, whether it's the environment, whether it's homelessness, whether it's education, whatever it is. And you know, develop a relationship with them where you can continue to ask questions and they're providing you information and you are becoming knowledgeable as maybe you're working together on a project.
Mary, I think you made a really important point. I just want to follow up a little bit on that.
Thank you.
Last week, I had a reason to go down to Cincinnati City Council. Valerie's been there. But they have something before the council begins where citizens can come in and talk for 3 minutes about an issue. And I just sat there thinking, person after person, this person is totally disenfranchised. They weren't being uncivil. They just had problems that they didn't know where else to go. Whether it's, I can't get from my house to the grocery store, there's no bus, or I've got a child that needs health care and I can't get them the health care. It was just one problem after another that no one in the room had an answer for. And they just listened politely. It's next, next. And that's a real problem out there. I don't have an answer for it.
That's what I mentioned before in my introductory comments. You go to a city council meeting, and when I was there, they often were talking to one another and not even listening, which created another set of problems. That people come to City Hall out of frustration because they don't know where else to go. But that is not the place to have your problem resolved, because public comment time is 3 minutes to share your comment. It is not response time. It is not action time. Nobody says a word. Now, as a public servant, I took it upon myself to take responsibility afterwards to go and grab those people and say, how can we help? And sometimes it's just really referral, and sometimes it's a wicked problem that's much broader than what the institution of government alone can do. You need community assets and community resources and other organizations to tap into. But it does speak to the fact that communities that are disenfranchised, that are underserved, that don't have the avenues that Mary talks about, aren't comfortable coming down and talking about the policies of an issue. They're struggling every day with concerns. How do we reach those people, and how do they feel connected to government? And as I also said, when they don't feel connected, what you have is an explosion and a riot and a boycott and people not talking, and sort of a dysfunctional community that people don't want to live in. So you've got to find ways of engaging and including. I think, Mary, you're right, absolutely, all people. And where there are barriers, what is government's responsibility to address those barriers and to eliminate them?
Next.
Well, I think before I move on to another question, I think one of the interesting things that Mary and Valerie's discussion about Martin Luther King Jr. made me think of is, you know, from the one hand, it's pretty easy to talk about being civil yourself, but you know, hopefully after you've taken, you know, Com 100, you realize that communication is not a one-way street. It's not just about what you do, but it's also the response and the reaction. And what I take away from the discussion that the two of you had is to underscore the fact that being civil is actually not easy, because you can only control your own actions, and you can't control the actions of others. And sometimes when you're being civil, other people aren't in response, and that's really difficult to manage. It's really difficult to be in that situation and try to maintain some level of respect for the other person while at the same time dealing with the fact that they're not respecting you. That's not easy, and it's really, I think, a deep-seated challenge that speaks to the two-way street of communication.
And it's not an equal two-way street, right? I mean, King was, in fact, being very civil, and the people who engaged in civil disobedience took extensive classes in which they had to practice being calm under atrocious circumstances where people were calling them names and physically assaulting them, and doing so that when they went to lunch counters and sat down people did terrible things to them, they would have had at least a little bit of practice and could take it. But even when they took it, their opposition was often accusing them of incivility. So no matter how civilly they may have behaved, the response to them very often was that they were the ones behaving badly. And so the question of how you manage that particular set of circumstances is one I think that's much trickier than if, like, oh, you're just not showing me respect, but I can still show you respect. But then he's actually accusing me of disrespect, which is this whole new level of like, wait, what? How is this happening? And the frustration, both on the individual and the institutional level that results from that, is not a small matter, I think, of consideration.
Just following up, are there ways to diffuse incivility in a personal relationship? Are there? Anybody?
Let me share a story.
Oh, hey, wait a minute, dude. This is a Me Too kind of moment. You back off on that, right? Even that's gotten dangerous.
Let me just share something that actually happened on the floor of the Senate a few years ago that's always stuck with me. We had a debate in the Education Committee about using the founding documents, you know, the Constitution, et cetera, as a requirement in all civics courses. And it passed through committee in spite of some rather heated debate in committee about whether or not speeches such as Frederick Douglass's speech from the back porch and some others that were important speeches, but they weren't founding documents. So it came to the floor, and one of the Democrats, an African-American woman, got up and started ranting about how the members of the Education Committee were racist because they had refused to include this, you know, these documents in this bill. And as the chairman, I got up and I said, you know, I'm asking for an apology. This is just not fair to call members of this committee racist. I got gavelled down because I was responding to something someone else said. You're not allowed to do that. And I get gavelled down, and okay, so we moved on. When session was over, this woman came up to me and she said, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to offend you. And I said, well, when someone calls me a racist, I find that offensive. And she says, well, I've had enough. We can't get anything done here. Every time we introduce a bill, you all vote against it. Every time we try to amend something, you table it. And this is all very true. That's exactly what we do to the minority party. And I looked at her and I said, Nina, we don't do that because you're African American. We do it because you're a Democrat. And she looked at me and she said, really? And I said, yeah, really. And from that day forward, the two of us were like this. We have been close. She is a regular commentator. She's not in the Senate anymore. A regular commentator on CNN. When I see her popping up, I instantly text her and rib her a little bit about, I know you're going to tell a story about your grandma. You always do. That sort of thing. But it struck me at the time, we had a very, very different perspective as to what was going on here. And it wasn't that either one of us was right, but it was that difference of perspective and the fact that we took the time to learn from each other solved that problem. And we worked together very well from that point on. And that's just, so I wanted to throw that.
I remember being in Cincinnati and in an environment like this, except that it was a church. And it was me and the mayor and the members of city council and our police leadership, and they were all white. In the council manager form of government, the employees worked for the city manager, so the chief was on one side and the deputy chief was on the other side. And we were in the audience explaining police response to the shooting I mentioned earlier and what we were going to do, and there were lawsuits and there were all kinds of issues. But this was a chance for people to just say whatever they wanted to say and raise whatever question they wanted to ask. They were so mean and so rude, and it was so personal that all of us were just taken aback, to the point that the police chief said, "I'm gonna pull my gun and see what happens." And I'm like, oh my God, don't do that. But that kind of, I think at that point we recognize that, oh my Lord, if where we are in our conversation is to have peace and civility, someone feels the need to pull a gun, we really have a problem here. That kind of broke the ice and made us all realize that it is important to hear voices, even if they're saying what you don't want to hear. And if they're emotional about it, and even if they're personal about it, particularly as a public official, you just have to recognize that their angst is so great that is the only way they believe their voice is going to be heard. And you have to find a way to bring it down. Obviously, I held my hand on the chief's knee the rest of the night to be quiet, be still, and to listen. The one thing we did that night that was different from before was to listen to what people had to say, not try to justify what anyone else had done, not try to explain away what anybody else had done, but to hear what people had to say and then ask them, now where should we go moving forward? What can we do tomorrow to make our life different and better than it was yesterday? So listening becomes a really important tool, and quite frankly, it's probably on both sides of the issue.
So, I mean, the question about how do we diffuse that tension, that lack of civility in an interpersonal relationship. You know, I think about what you said, Fred, about the tribalism that we have. I hear that mentioned a lot. And if we think about tribes, right, the reason tribes are different is because they have different cultures. That's what makes them different tribes, right? So, I'm guessing that probably some of you maybe have studied abroad or are hoping to study abroad, right? So you think about that. Think about that for a moment. If you're going to a different culture, there's some things you want to do. You want to, understand their customs, their perspectives, their histories, before you make, conclusions about what they're like and what they're about and how you fit in. And we're kind of attuned to that when we go, at least we should be attuned to that when we go overseas. Often Americans aren't, and that's what gets us into trouble when we go overseas, among some other things maybe. But, I think that hopefully if you do study abroad right, you treat that as a learning opportunity to learn about another culture, which also helps you learn about yourself. Well, I think that when we purposefully build friendships with people that have different perspectives than we do, that is a similar learning opportunity that we have. So similar to Fred's advice about, hey, don't just pay attention to one news source, which that is great advice. I did that shortly after 2016. I was like, hey, I don't want to just be in my own partisan echo chamber, so I have 3 different apps on my phone. One is to the right, one is to the left, one's in the center. And it astounds me when I see just one of those, and I'm like, man, if that was my only view of the world, I might have a very warped perspective on things. So I think that helps you break beyond that. But I think likewise, building relationships. I have a friend that's a professor that recently did one of those. At Facebook, you can do polls and ask questions. I don't know if you've seen people do that. And he asked the question, hey, do you generally agree with me about politics, or do we disagree? And his results came back 93% agree, 7% disagree. Now, that might be people, just not being willing to come and say, hey, I disagree with you. That might be face-threatening. But I think that probably that's not just my friend. I think that's probably a lot of us tend to gravitate toward those of us that, that people that have beliefs that are similar to ours, and that's a general human tendency. None of us is beyond that effect. Homophily is the technical name for it within the interpersonal literature. But we also know from interpersonal research that intergroup contact reduces bias toward groups that are different than ours. So I know that's maybe not addressing a specific interpersonal conflict that's active, but I think as a preemptive strike against that, we should be thinking, hey, how can I build relationships with those that have different perspectives, not just because I want to learn, I mean, that's valuable, but because they're human beings, because they are worthy of decency and respect, and I want to build connections with them in a meaningful way.
So democracy actually depends on that, right? Danielle Allen, in her wonderful book, talks about the importance of democracy as shared sacrifice. And what happens when people get as enraged as the ones that were being talked about here, partly that's because they feel like the sacrifice is always on them. That the idea is that in a democratic country, that sometimes you win and sometimes she wins, and sometimes you both, compromise being defined as that position in which everyone is equally unhappy, right? That's like a valid compromise. But there is something in that if we're gonna work together, you've got to give up something and I've got to give up something. But if every time I work with him, I'm the one who's always doing the giving up, I'm the one who's always losing, the more it feels like that to me, the higher the temperature in the room is going to get, right? So one of the ways to diffuse it is to make sure that people are being heard when they talk about the actual, because politics often involves legitimate pain. And listening to people express that pain sometimes comes at very soft crying temperatures and sometimes at enraged crying temperatures, right? Because pain is involved and sacrifice is not easy. But if we had a sense that the sacrifice was widely shared instead of always falling on one group or one set of groups, then democracy is a healthier, is in a healthier institutional position, I would say.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is just another version of what we've all said is another version of listening. So do not try hugging somebody to cure this problem. I got that. But no, it's active listening. So nobody likes, it's not like that listening when you're with your significant other where they're talking, yeah, honey, yeah, yeah, sure, yeah, It's not that kind of listening. Right. No, the most.
That's the person you want to be hugging, dude.
the most infuriating thing to somebody is going on a listening tour and then just doing what you were going to do anyway, because it's a dog and pony show, and so it's active listening, but it's also being able to validate what somebody has said, that you actually heard what they said, it made sense to you. You could spit it back to them in a way that conveyed that you actually were listening, and that you meant it, sincerity. And then they're willing to perhaps do the same for you. That is the easiest way to bring the temperature down, is to let somebody talk. And I think Valerie has talked about it, other people have talked about, when people have anxiety and they feel frustrated or disenfranchised and nobody's listening and they can't see light at the end of the tunnel, it makes them very uncomfortable. And so the notion that you were willing to listen and they got to get that out and off their chest, and then you could spit it back to them that, well, have you ever thought about that? Or really talk and dive into it. Then they may have just had the information wrong, but they couldn't have heard you until you listened to them. And then that opens the door to be able to impart different information. And now you're having a conversation. And really good things can come out of a conversation, but yelling almost never produces anything constructive. So.
When was the last time any of you invited over your apartment or your dorm room or to a restaurant, a colleague or a fellow student that you just liked automatically, you thought you had a lot in common, but they were a different race, they were of a different culture, and something held you back? It's finding what holds you back and getting the courage inside to broach that friend and say, I really like spending time with you. Would you like to come over and meet my family and bring your family? It starts with relationship building. You build trust through relationships and finding ways, even as a student, to build trust. You have student government here. How many times have you talked to your student government leadership? How does that conversation go? What do you present? How do you present it? It's a similar microcosm of what's going to happen outside in the larger community. So think about your own responsibilities to build relationships, to build trust, and to start now so that when you are on the city council or in the General Assembly or you're governor of the state, you have already developed the habit of listening and hearing and recognizing the stories and people's pain and thinking about ways that you as an individual and as a representative of power can do something about it.
So at this point, what I'd like to do is see if there are questions that you all would like to address to the panel and to the group that we have assembled. So if you kindly raise your hand, I will try to make my way up the aisles.
This is how we figure out whether people are forced to be here or not.
My name is Aaron Woods. Our question is, well, first off, I stereotype of what you would think an old white man to be. And so, of course, I already had a preconceived idea of what that is. He's racist, he's not going to like me, classist, Republican. He was older than Republican, which was true, but when that 2016 election came, and I knew that he voted for Trump, it was very hard for me to accept that. And because he never was racist to me, never put me down in any way, loved me like his own. But to know that was very hard for me to see. So I guess my question is, how do we separate the two behind the face of Trump and the people who voted for him?
So this is actually, it's a wonderful question, so thank you for that. And there's a difference between interpersonal relationships and structural relationships, right? Andrew Jackson, who is kind of famous for being an Indian fighter, he was the president under which Cherokee removal happened, widely considered to be as anti-Indian as any president we've ever had an adopted Indian child he loved like his own son. Because we are able to separate institutional politics from personal relationships. And so someone can love someone who is of a different race or can be nice to their wife or female partner and still vote for policies that seem to damage African Americans or women, because we don't live on both planes at the same time and often don't see the contradictions between those spaces, right? So that's the explanation. What to do about it would be these people.
Or did you ask him why? Because I understand that some people may have voted for Trump not necessarily because of his policies, but because he represented something new and they were frustrated with the system as it was. So was it the way he approached it? Was the fact that he was an outsider? Teasing out what were the motivations, and you might find that there was some commonality in the motivations. You may still not have voted for Trump, but you may at least find some commonalities that allow you to understand that that loving relationship is an honest relationship, and so I'd suggest just talking to him.
I think along those lines, I'd say that we need to grant that people are complex and they have complex and diverse motivations for doing what they do, particularly when basically you have a binary choice. Yeah, you could write in a third party on the ballot, but most people end up voting for either the Democrat or the Republican. And I think reducing the motivation to just one thing, that's not the case for anybody, left, right, or center. There's a number of different reasons why somebody may vote for a candidate. They may disagree, and I've heard people, I'm conservative, so that's, if I have an echo chamber, I try to get beyond that, but that would be my echo chamber. And I know that there are people that I know, many of them, that would say, there's a lot of things I don't like about Trump, but I voted for him because I care about the Supreme Court, or I'm just frustrated and there needs to be a change, or there's some other reason. I would just love to see people get to a point, rather than simplifying each other's motivations. We can acknowledge we have complex motivations, and once we do that, we do a couple of things. We grant them their humanity, because that's our nature as human beings, and then we can talk more specifically about, okay, I want to understand that motivation. Here's my motivation for why I didn't. I'm concerned about certain elements of his approach, or his rhetoric, or his social policy, or whatever. And then that's a more meaningful conversation than, hey, you're writing off me because you voted for this person. So I think just, understanding that we have complex motivations for why we vote as we do, why we engage politically as we do, I think is a key step.
I'm very concerned about the story you described being repeated over and over and over across this country. I have a nephew who the family's been dying for him to get married. And he brought home this lovely girl, and everyone thought she was terrific, and they were all so happy for Matt. And then it was like, oh my God, we just found out she voted for Trump. And it was no longer was she lovely. No longer was she a perfect mate for their son or their brother. And I hear that over and over and over again. So I totally agree with Andrew. You have to kind of talk that through, but how in the world did we ever get in a situation where we're shunning people's friendships and family members because they voted for someone that we didn't approve of?
Well, and I want to be careful about scapegoating here, because that's often uncivil, but I will for a moment scapegoat, I think, the media culture that I think profits, let's be frank, they profit off of our outrage, okay? We tune into the partisan media channel because they feed into our echo chamber and they feed into our rage. And I'm not a journalist, so I can't speak to the civic ethics of that in a way that a journalist could. But there's something about that that concerns me. So maybe in addition to diversifying our news sources, sometimes stepping back from the news, realizing there's more going on in the world than what's happening inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. Is that important? Yes. Is it the most important thing in most of our lives? If we're honest, probably not.
I think there's an internal question there as well, is does somebody have to agree with me politically for me to be okay with them? That's a question you have to say, taking into account some of what's been said up here, that people vote for people for different reasons, but we're all different. We all process information differently. Some people care about just the bottom line, and some people care about taking care of or doing no harm. There are a lot of different things that motivate us, and that tends to be how individually we process information. What's important to me as somebody who wants to take care of or do no harm is not necessarily the most important thing to somebody who wants a bottom line, right? I don't care that he's rude. I don't necessarily like it. I'm pretending to be somebody else right now, right? I don't necessarily care that he's rude. I just want to know, is what he's going to do make things better or worse? And if I believe that, I'm maybe not even paying attention to the things that he may say that might be incendiary or hurtful or sometimes a little insensitive. I may not even pay attention to that because that's not what drives me. That's not what I care about. So.
There was
This is more a question based on when do we have to zero civil. Just for quick context, I'm an active volunteer. The Ohio Libertarian Party, activist voter. We'll probably go break that out. Who knows? I have to do more research before I do. Libertarian. Our university we're currently residing at is being sued by the state party. Chrissy Wickers in District 77, her voting right, her right to vote was challenged because she changed her name and there was a misdemeanor before she changed her name. Luckily she won that Board of Elections hearing. But when do we have to appear uncivil? Because every time I feel like we make any progress, the rules change. The thing in Ohio, 2012, 2013, there was a special bill passed that was proactive, that was basically the Protect John Kasich bill, as it was promptly named, because it changed the debate rules the year of a governor election. So where do we go out and say this is wrong? Because the institution is protecting itself at the end of the day. That's just my question.
I don't know that you ever have to be uncivil per se. I mean, I think probably the closest you're going to get to that when real constitutional crises are ignored, then you start to enter that territory. But when something is wrong, you don't necessarily have to be in civil. You have to be engaged. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Be passionate. Be engaged. Mobilize. I think President Obama said, don't boo, vote. Pay attention. If it's your priority, something you care about, pay attention, show up, do the work. That doesn't necessarily require incivility to do that and to have an impact. You just got to be direct and passionate about it, and there's nothing wrong with that. I do not remember Bill Clinton or Barack Obama ever being, or George Bush, quite frankly, either one, necessarily being all that incivil about what they did. And people said a lot of things about Bill Clinton, a lot of things about Barack Obama, but they were organized, they were motivated, they were passionate. They didn't let people say bad things about them without responding to them. But then they came back to, in my opinion, elections are always about the future. They came back to painting a picture of how you make a better America. And they let that compete with whatever was going on against them, and you have a choice to make. Which one do you want to gravitate to? I personally think we do better when we do that. And I think most people want to know, are you going to make the future brighter? For me and my kids, more importantly for most adults, is I'm worried about what's going to happen to my kids and my parents. So I don't know that unless it enters the realm that people are doing really illegal things and they're just ignoring the rule of law, I don't know that it enters that space.
And also, I think it's important that we don't confuse incivility was civil disobedience. There's plenty of room for civil disobedience in our political process, and no one's talking about that today. We're
Yeah,
talking
and
about-
you do that when you think it's gonna work, right?
Yeah.
When that's the tactic, because any social movement, any group that has a goal to pursue, you don't have to use just one tactic, right? You find a sympathetic member of the legislature, you figure out a way to get a case in front of the courts, you hit the streets if that's relevant. You can do all of those things without having to engage in anything that looks like incivility necessarily, right? So the tactics you choose have to be the ones that, what do you think is gonna work given the situation in front of me, right? That's a tactical question, I guess.
Yeah.
There's a question up here.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So, find myself in a lot of political conversations, especially with,
Is that on?
of course, not
Is
all.
that on? We can't hear him.
Yeah. Just speak up loudly.
Hello?
Hello?
So,
Sure, let's
as
talk right here.
a, I guess this isn't really a question, more of a topic of conversation, but I often find more than I'd like to that my political views are dismissed or disregarded because of my religious affiliation as a Catholic. And so, I mean, what can we do to at least make our voices be heard a little bit more against people who reject people's opinions because of their religious beliefs?
I'm going to respond to that because I understand where you're coming from. As a Catholic and as a pro-life Catholic, there's a real dilemma, facing. I know a lot of pro-life Catholics who voted for Donald Trump for one reason and one reason only, and that was the court. Andrew referred to that. And I think that's just something we have to respect, frankly, that was enough of a motivation that, many Catholics went that direction. And I have sensed it too, as a Republican Catholic woman. I'm not going to say if I voted for Trump or not, because it's not relevant, but I know exactly where you're coming from. And there have been lots of Catholics who have voted out of deep conscience that have been mocked and vilified because they made that choice. And it's just wrong. We just have to fight back.
Can I ask, are you speaking to the argument that, you should not force your religious beliefs on me because of the First Amendment, or is it some other concern or some other argument that you've experienced for why, as a Catholic, you should not express your political beliefs?
I mean, I guess it'd be, I guess it'd be both, because a lot of non-religious people, I mean, of course not all, but find that it's immoral for me to vote for my religious beliefs because they are based on something that is not proven.
I think we go back to the First Amendment. You are guaranteed not just freedom of worship, but freedom of religion. And if you want to, allow that to play out in your vote and how you participate in the public square, the First Amendment was designed so that you can do that. Now, certainly, the First Amendment also, guarantees that we won't all be forced to be Catholic. Or, and that's a complex legal issue, and I'm not a lawyer trained to address the finer points of that law. My wife is trained as an attorney, so I hear her voice in the back of my head saying, "Don't say things about the law that you're not, equipped to say." But that might be an opportunity to understand, why do people think that? What is the fear that they express? And perhaps you can inform them, hey, this is who I am. I can't separate my faith identity from who I am. I can't keep it in a box over here to use on Sundays and not apply the rest of the week. It has to enter into everything in my life. I don't share your faith, but from my faith is as a Protestant, I would, think about my faith in the same way. So perhaps trying to use it as an educational opportunity for you to learn from them and them to learn from you might be one way forward.
I would say this. I mean, I would start by saying the voter is inherently never wrong. I lost a race for the Senate in 2010, and I didn't really whine about it a lot. I whined about it a little bit, but
Want a hug?
I do. Okay.
He conned you, he didn't need
But,
that.
But I asked first.
but what I held But what I held on to was the public, the voter is inherently never wrong. You can vote for whatever reason you want to. To the extent that it's a lot of people, he won, so there are a lot of people that think you're right? So, I mean, I would hang on to that. No matter who you vote for, somebody's always going to have an issue with it for whatever reason. I wouldn't get too caught up in that. When we talk about using our religious faith as a guidepost, again, you can, but without getting into which one is right or wrong, I think what the real conversation has to be about is that public space or not? Should I or should I not be doing that as a politician? What I think may have happened a number of times is people try to make you think that your values are wrong. Everybody in here, your values are right because they're your values. They're yours. There's nothing for me to tell you that your values are wrong. I think there's a bigger conversation around, does everything you don't like become public policy? Does that make it my job? If I believe in limited government, where's that line? So I think reasonable people can disagree where that is, but I think the conversation needs to be about where's the line, and just because you don't like it personally, does that make it my job? And so, but your values are your values, and they're valid just because you hold it. You don't have to prove that or explain that to anybody, so.
Word.
So, I understand from the gnashing of teeth and packing of bags that we've reached 6:30 on a Friday evening. I do want to thank, and I would hope that we would want to thank the panelists.
If I lived in Ohio, I would so.
I am running unopposed. And I am running.
So fair.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that?
I'm the leader for